You are now listening to Hinckley Community Radio, a non-profit podcast radio station. Tonight's show of Mark's Unexplained World will be exploring two true stories which remain unexplained to this day. That of the missing crew of the Sarah Joe and a bonus story of the Phoenix Lights. Enjoy.
On the 11th of February 1979, 5 local men took the day off work to go on a fishing trip on their 17-foot Boston whaler, the Sarah Joe, from the town of Hana, located on the southeast shore of the Hawaii island Maui. The men were never seen alive again. After a total of 5 days searching and 73,000 miles covered, the search for the men was officially suspended. No trace of the Sarah Joe or any of the 5 men were found. Then, on the 9th of September 1988, nearly 10 years later, pieces of the Sarah Joe were found on an island over 2,000 miles away. An unmarked shallow grave was also found on the shore of the island, where the remains of one of the men were found buried under a pile of rocks. Greetings, Unexplained peeps. Thank you for tuning in and listening to Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a cartoonist, a wicker and a cold beer on a hot day. Tonight I'm going to tell you 2 stories. First, the mysterious story about the crew of the Sarah Joe. And second, I'm going to look at the strange phenomena known as the Phoenix Lights. I will now give you the necessary disclaimer. All opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts still remain true. So, back to the first story. According to Wikipedia, the island of Maui is the 2nd largest of the islands of the state of Hawaii, and it is the 17th largest island in the United States. In 2010, Maui had a population of 144,444, and according to the island's own website, Maui, Hawaii is known for its exquisite beaches, 14 lush green golf courses, a rich collection of wildlife, and is the 2nd largest island in Hawaii. Also known as the Valley Isle, Maui is home to several beaches and tree parks where you can also take in the cultural and historical sites. The 5 men on the fishing trip were 38-year-old Benjamin Kalama, 27-year-old Ralph Malakini, 27-year-old Scott Mormon, 26-year-old Patrick Wosner, and 31-year-old Peter Hanchett. They had been friends for several years, and between them they had over 50 years of seagoing experience. At the time, 27-year-old Ralph earned his living as a professional fisherman. The Sarah Joe was a 17-foot Boston whaler owned by Ralph Malinsky's twin brother, Robert, who was more than happy to let the men use it. The vessel was named after their mother, Sarah, and their father, Joe. The day started very well as they left the harbour at around 10 a.m. The water was calm and it was a nice, clear day. However, at 1 p.m, a freak wind swept in from the mountains. It was a warning that a storm was about to strike. The bad weather and wind change concerned Peter's father, John Hanchett Sr. So he and several others went to the shoreline to try and spot the boat to wave the fishermen in. However, they were unable to see the Sarah Joe. The storm had arrived in the area within a matter of hours, along with strong winds and crashing waves. John then went out again in another vessel in the middle of the storm to search for the Sarah Joe. After several hours, he returned to the shore without finding any trace of them. The obvious conclusion was that the 5 men had probably got lost at sea in the storm and drowned. The next day, he was joined on the search by marine biologist John Norton. But again, they returned, having found no trace of the Sarah Joe or its occupants. John Norton said of the search, and I quote, "The initial place where we started searching was very ill-defined because we weren't really sure exactly where the Sarah Joe had gone fishing. So initially it encompassed a relatively large area that first day, and then the area searched got bigger and bigger." On the third day, Captain Jim Cushman of the Coast Guard continued the search for the Sarah Joe by helicopter and ship. 5 days later, the search was officially and unexpectedly suspended after a total of 73,000 square miles had been searched, one of the largest sea searches in the history of Hawaii. Although John Hatchett Sr. did agree that the Sarah Joe was ill-equipped to face such a massive storm head-on, he believed that his son and his fellow fishermen were strong, healthy and good enough swimmers who were more than capable of helping one another. He and the other friends' families would only believe that the 5 friends survived the storm if any debris of the vessel had been found. John Hatchett Sr. said, and I quote, "But nothing was found, nothing, and so we felt there was still a chance that they were afloat and alive." But no trace of the Sarah Joe or any of the 5 men was ever found. During the following weeks, residents of the little town of Hana searched the local beaches, looking for any wreckage of the Sarah Joe, until finally they gave up the search. But they never gave up hope. It took a year for hope to die in Hana when a memorial service was held for the missing fishermen. Finally, in the absence of their remains, the 5 men were laid to rest with a simple plaque overlooking the boat ramp at Hana Bay on Maui's east side. To commemorate the 10th anniversary of the boat's disappearance, both family and friends of the missing sailors got together by the plaque on the pier where the 5 men had departed. As time passed, it seemed as if memories were all that was left of the missing men and the Sarah Joe. Then, on the 9th of September 1988, the case of the Sarah Joe took a bizarre turn. On that day, marine biologist John Norton was on a wildlife expedition in the Marshall Islands, an independent island country near the equator of the Pacific Ocean, slightly to the west of the international dateline, 22,000 miles west of Maui. While near a deserted atoll called Taongai, he spotted a small boat that had washed on shore. Norton and his crew landed on the atoll to examine the wreckage. They could see some of the registration numbers on the side of the boat, which indicated that it had been registered in the Hawaiian Islands. Approximately 60 yards from the wreckage, Norton's crew discovered a makeshift grave. It included a pile of coral rocks and a crudely made wooden cross. They also discovered a human jawbone protruding out of the pile of rocks. At the time, they were not certain if the graveside was connected to the wrecked boat. The men found no evidence that the island was inhabited. Norton recorded the registration numbers on the boat and left the site undisturbed. The Coast Guard ran a check on the numbers and determined that the boat was the Sarah Joe. After the wreckage was identified, the nearby gravesite was excavated. A partial human skeleton was uncovered. Dental records determined that the remains belonged to Scott Mormon, one of the 5 missing men of the Sarah Joe. So what had happened to the other 4 occupants? And who buried Scott Mormon? Experts agreed that the Sarah Joe could have drifted the 2,000 miles to the Marshall Islands. The voyage would have taken about 3 months, but the problem is, according to the brother of one of the missing men, a US government survey of Taongai in 1985, just 3 years earlier, found no trace of the Sarah Joe or its remains. If this is true, then where was the Sarah Joe between 1979 disappearance, the 1985 survey and the 1988 discovery? Another strange clue surfaced when unusual pieces of paper were discovered in the grave. These papers had been buried deliberately. The papers were in an unbound stack, 3/4 inches by 3/4 inches, alternated by slips of tin foil material placed between the pages. The Coast Guard at the time had not been able to determine who placed the paper there or for what purpose. However, it was later theorised that the cryptic papers found with Scott's remains may have been part of a Chinese burial ritual representing money and fortune in the next life. Known as Joss paper, hell money or ghost money, gold and silver foil such as the ones inserted between the papers also represented money or good fortune for the dead to help them along in the next life. Many questions haunt the case of the Sarah Joe. The family and friends of the missing men still hope that one day they will learn what really happened to their loved ones. The families of the 5 men hired private investigator Steve Goodenow to look into the loss of the crew using weather data, information from the officials of 3 governments and his own personal searching. He took a team to Taongai and discovered a few bones belonging to Scott Morgan near the original grave. Divers also found the boat's engines wedged underneath the water in a nearby coral reef. Goodenow theorised that before the Sarah Joe swung southwest, it was carried by the storm northwest very close to the Kauai Island in Taonga Atoll, and at that point some of the men tried to swim ashore but drowned under the rough seas. Scott, though, stayed on the boat and survived starvation and dehydration until the Sarah Joe drifted into the atoll after 2 months of sailing. This explains why Scott's body was the only one left aboard when the boat crashed over the reef at Sybil Island, and given the narrow channel between the reefs and islands, it is unlikely the boat could have reached the Taongai Lagoon without human interference. The brother of missing crew member Ralph Malachini, Robert Malachini, also thinks that Scott Morgan could have tied himself to the boat to weather the storm. He also doubts that anyone from the Sarah Joe could have survived the storm and that the 2,200-mile journey to Taongai. It is also possible Goodenow theorised that a few years later a Taiwanese fishing boat found Scott's remains and buried him. He further thought that the fishermen wouldn't have reported the incident since they had been fishing in the area illegally. There are no suspects nor any evidence of foul play in their disappearances. For most individuals, the tragic accident of the Sarah Joe could have been avoided, but the 5 friends decided not to concern themselves about the weather forecast for that day. But to be honest, who can blame them? I'm not a sailor, heck, I'm not even a good swimmer. But for most sailors or fishermen, I should imagine the call of the ocean is beyond a temptation that nobody could say no to. According to Google, more than 80% of the ocean remains unexplored. And because it's difficult to protect what we don't know, only about 7% of the world's oceans are designated as marine protected areas, or MPAs. Often we just forget what lies beyond its surface and what unexplained forces give rise to unforgivable maritime tragedies. The town of Hana has made sure it does not forget the names of Benjamin Kalama, Ralph Malachini, I do apologise, Scott Morgan, Patrick Wozner and Peter Hanchett, the 5-man crew of the Sarah Joe. In Hana Bay, the memorial plaque still stands in place, engraved on the words, "Hannah remembers her sons," which eases the pain knowing deep down that the 4 remaining men may never be found. Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. After a short break, we'll be taking a look at the Phoenix Lights.
This show is brought to you by courtesy of Neil Packer and the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. Find them online at www.hauntedresearchcentre.com or at 9 to 11